All right. Well, welcome to episode 3 of the Healthy Brain, Healthy Mind podcast series. I'm Dr. Jay Kumar. Dr. Jay, as most everyone knows, which is Jay. And we are so fortunate to talk to Veronica Clanton-Higgins today, who is, I'll introduce her briefly just a bit, but as part of May's Mental Health Awareness Month, for those of you who are maybe tuning in for the first time, it really is important to talk about contemporary issues that are going on in our society. And we'll be talking today. The general theme is like healing from the trauma of hate and injustice, and really beginning to see the intersectionality of systemic racism, intolerance, bigotry, hatred, and how it really impacts not just our individual mental health, but our collective mental health as well. And so I'm delighted to introduce, may I call you Veronica?
Yes, that's okay, perfect. Thank
Veronica, we're very, you can call me Jay. We're very casual here, right? So Veronica Clanton-Higgins is a therapist here at Chapman's Student Psychological Counseling Services. She's also an author, educator, life coach, motivational speaker, and CEO of VCH Prosperity Consulting. The goal of VCH Prosperity Consulting is to ensure that people are provided the tools necessary to navigate the complexities of life, whether at home, in the community, or in the workplace. Veronica is a native of Compton, California, native SoCal woman over here, which is great. Veronica is known for community advocacy, support of families, and healing of women. Her work includes a research study in collaboration with California State University Long Beach, focused on reducing stress in African-American women through the use of mindfulness-based cognitive behavior therapy. Recently, Veronica has collaborated with Cedars-Sinai, Maternal Mental Health Now, and Black Women for Wellness to create mindfulness-based curriculum for African-American children to assist in increasing emotional awareness. She works with women to find their happiness through workshops, one-on-one coaching, and psychoeducation. Veronica's goal is to empower 100 women to not walk in their hurt, but to reclaim their power and live life on purpose. So this is a great way to start our conversation. I just love that phrase, to empower 100 women to not walk in their hurt. So we can talk about that shortly, but I would like to ask you, Veronica, maybe just to share what inspired you, inspired is a good word, to pursue this path into therapy and to go into social work.
Well, as you read in my bio, I am a native of Compton, California, and I grew up in Compton, California in the 80s. And so what a lot of people don't know, that Compton is actually a suburb. It's predominantly white until the late 1960s, right? And then, of course, we had a lot of Black families move out this way from the South. So some moved to Watts, South Central, and of course, Compton. Around the 80s is when we saw the crack epidemic. And it significantly changed the landscape of the community. And so as a young girl growing up during the height of gang violence, the crack epidemic, watching mass incarceration of neighbors and friends and things of that nature, and also realizing as I got older that I myself was suffering from trauma, vicariously from existing and living in these spaces. And so growing up, I saw a lot of people suffering from addiction. I saw a lot of domestic violence, a lot of gun violence. And to the point where we used to live in an apartment complex, and it got so horrible in the apartment complex that my mom wouldn't let us go outside to play anymore, because there were people selling drugs, using drugs, soliciting, doing activities to acquire their drugs. And so my sister and I weren't allowed to play outside. And when my brother was born, none of us was allowed to go outside. And so one instance that always sits with me is they used to do raids, like drug raids. And they had this thing called the Bam Around, where they would rip your bar door off, literally just rip it off the hinges. They had this device that would do that. I remember one night we heard it. Mind you, my mom was the only person living in this apartment building not using or selling drugs. And so the police, LAPD, came in, they ripped the door off. I remember the guns because it's the middle of the night. I remember the guns because the guns have a light on the end. So we remember the guns. I was 10. My sister was 7. My brother was a baby. And they made us all get on the floor with the guns pointed at us, right? My mom is screaming. I'm 10. I don't know what's going on. And kind of find out they raided the wrong house. So you just traumatize a whole family because of an error. And so that really stuck out to me because it was a catalyst for, this is not right. How dare they do this to us? No apologies, no are you okay, no link to resources for any psychological trauma counseling, nothing. They just said they're sorry and left. Mind you, they ripped our door off. They didn't come back to put the door back on. And so, you know, instances like that that really fuel my desire for advocacy, activism, and social work in the aspect of speaking for those who don't have a voice for themselves, and also the clinical aspect of it, because I saw what it did to the community, like mass incarceration. When those men came home, they were not the same individuals they were when they went into the jail system. Families were torn apart by drugs and all these different things. So that is what really fueled my desire to do the work and actually remain in Compton and surrounding areas to do the work.
That is a powerful story, Veronica. And I think, you know, as a social worker and a therapist, I think you're well aware how complex trauma, you know, we use the word complex trauma because trauma is not just a single source. There can be many instances of trauma that happen repeatedly over one's lifetime. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to really reveal this notion of what we call systemic racism.
Absolutely.
And so would you be able to maybe just share with our audience, I mean, that's a lot of people hear that term and that word, institutional racism, or maybe systemic racism. How would you define it as in not only, you know, maybe as someone who is in your field, how would you describe that term?
Institutionalized racism, as our society operating as the way it's set up to operate. It is an oppressive system. And I always want to remind people, my husband is a history teacher. And so we have very interesting conversation because, you know, I'm very, and he's very, so one thing we do agree on is the institution of racism. So an institution is where people learn, they get skills, they're like, how can I say this without being offensive? So when America was created and Black people were first brought over, right? We were not brought over to be neighbors. Yeah. Yeah. And so also, if you look at the history of, and people, you guys, Google is your friend, you can look it up. But if you look at the history of the police department, it was set up to catch slaves. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at the system that was set up, the system was not set up for BIPOC individuals to thrive, right? This is why we had segregation and Jim Crow. That's why they had lynchings where they would actually have like a picnic and hang people from trees, strange fruit hanging from trees. And so the institution is operating in the way the institution was set up to operate. And so when we look at institutionalized racism, I always say it's just the institution operating the way the institution was set up to operate. But luckily, through those who are advocates and who are activists, we realize, hey, we have a voice, we have opportunity to make little changes in the system so we can begin to make a grand change. So we got to make those micro steps in order to impact things on a macro level. And so that's how I always view it. I always say, how do we operate within the system? To me, which is that micro thing that we're all looking at right now, is how do we operate within the system to make the change that can be a macro change that serves everyone involved, BIPOC and non-BIPOC.
Right. And so for people who are aware of that term BIPOC, tell people what that acronym means, BIPOC. Just so
BIPOC means Black, Indigenous People of Color. So it just means anyone who is not of necessarily Caucasian or European descent.
Right. And I think you really bring up an important point. I teach a happiness course every spring semester. And a part of that course is we talk about social constructs of happiness. And I'm going to say this because this is something we talked about in our class. Sometimes the face of happiness looks like the face of privilege. And when I say that, it's a term by Sarah Ahmed, and she talks about this in her work on social constructs of happiness. And it's this idea that sometimes people who are marginalized or oppressed are forced to put on the face of happiness in order to not disrupt the status quo of what the happiness hegemony looks like. The word hegemony is a really core concept as well. And this idea is that when you have people who begin to speak up, whether, let's say, Rosa Parks is one example, Martin Luther King, or even like Cesar Chavez, or I'm thinking, Harvey Milk, people who have been systemically, institutionally marginalized from people at the top of the hierarchy, if you will. When they start expressing their outrage or their sense of injustice, they get labeled as troublemakers.
Yes.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
They get labeled as troublemakers. They get labeled as angry Black women, or the feminist killjoys.
Absolutely.
Or like the militant, gay, queer, if you will.
Right.
Whatever that term is. And so these are terms that the people on top and the hegemony label the people who they believe are disrupting the social order. And so I want to introduce this term to you. I've been using it. I'm working on a book right now called America's State of Mind. And I talk about this idea, and it's this idea like, we talk about racism or homophobia, or whatever form of marginalization, is. I call it in the context what I call placism. Now, placism is interesting because placism, what it implies is there are people who believe they are on the hierarchy, on the top place of the hierarchy, of the social hierarchy. And anyone who is under that tries to disrupt it, get labeled all these troublemakers. So it's almost like know your place. Right. Society. And so what's really happening in our society, it's not just racism is an expression of it, maybe even, gender bias or transphobia, et cetera, you want to name it. For me, it really goes to this idea of placism. And it comes from, and tell me if you feel this, it comes from a place of this notion that the people who are on top fear change.
Oh, yes. I can see that because even back during slavery, if you ever heard the term drapetomania, when a slave was trying to run away, they said that they had a mental illness. And so, like you stated, it's like, oh, wait, you want freedom. Come back here. You get back in line. So now we have to pathologize what you're doing because it disrupts us. And it's also, you're out of place, right? So you got out of line. So we have this line here, right? And you got out of that line. And because you got out of that line, you also are encouraging others to get out of that line. So how do we keep this line? How do we keep it, right? And then this is when you start, that placism sounds perfect because the place is behind the line, right? So that way, they can see what people are doing and keep the order and control in order to keep the hierarchy system working as it was constructed to work.
Mhm. Yeah, so places, thank you for saying, because I think placism works not just on a geographic level, like saying people of a certain color or ethnicity,
Mhm.
whatever. This is your place. Geographically, there's also, this is your status, your social
Mhm.
placement in society. That's why I love the word placism. So let's actually talk about, in terms of, there's so much we could talk about. Let's actually shift the conversation more towards mental health.
Okay.
This is, I work specifically around the field of, my area of interest is looking at trauma.
Mhm.
And my first book, Science of a Happy Brain, looks at how trauma impacts us on the individual level,
Right.
but then how that impacts the collective. And
Mhm.
now I'm kind of looking at the other, how does collective trauma impact the individual?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is always a good, and I'm gonna say this and I'm gonna answer your question because I literally posted on my Instagram. I said we can have vicarious trauma. Why can't we have vicarious healing? Right. So we can get trauma vicariously. Why can't we heal vicariously? And so what we're looking at is the vicarious impact of trauma. So especially when we're looking at racialized trauma.
Mhm.
Which is what we seem to be more attuned to right now because of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other names that we can mention who are BIPOC, not just the Black individuals, but any individual, right? And so when we look at racialized trauma, it is just basically trauma that is the result of racism, right? And how it impacts the collective. Because when we look at what happened last summer, that is racialized trauma because that trauma was the result of a racist incident, right? And so what we saw happen is people were watching it on repeat, right? And so they were impacted. So those who are impacted the most are those who belong to the group of the individual who was whose life was taken. And so when we look at the collective, right, watching people marching and fighting and just speaking up, right, on an individual level, it can have a severe impact because vicariously you are being impacted by this because these are individuals who look like you, look like your uncle, your grandmother, your neighbor, right? And so when we think as human beings, we're all existing on this planet together in this space, right? And we all intrinsically share certain things. If you see somebody cry, guess what's going to happen? You're going to want to cry, right? If someone laughs full of joy, like you hear a baby laugh, that purity in that laugh, you're going to laugh, right? So guess what? When you see someone hurt from race or racism and you connect to that, it's going to impact you as well, especially when we're looking at social media and the impact that it's having on our youth, right? And so I have a 17-year-old son. And when we were looking at the George Floyd incident, he was around 16 because he turned 17 last September. And what I noticed was a decline in him. And so finally I had to sit him down. And what I told him, I said, okay, I need you to stay off social media. I said, okay. And I explained to him how when we watch something over and over, what it does to the brain and our emotional regulation system and stuff in ways he's used to me talking to him like that. And so he cried because he said, Mom, am I going to die? So here I am with my 16-year-old son. And I said, you know what, son, right now, all we're trying to do is get through this moment. I cannot answer that question for you. 'Cause I'm not going to lie to my son, right? I said, I can't answer that question for you. I said, at some point, we all transition from this physical life, right? I said, I don't know when your transition is going to happen. You don't know when mine is going to happen. But for right now, let's just try to get through this moment. So this is what I need you to do. So this is when I told him to stay off social media, listen to happy music, come in and watch a movie with me. We'll laugh because guess what? What everyone was doing collectively was impacting my son on an individual level. And so that's how when we look at the collective does have a profound impact on individuals because the individuals make up the collective. And so when we're looking at racialized trauma is those who belong to the group being impacted, whether they are Latinx, whether they are African American, indigenous, whatever group. Even when we look at our AAPI population and what's been going on lately, they're more impacted because they belong to the group that is being a source for the racism. And so, yeah, it's just collective does impact the individual. And now it goes back to that macro, micro now, as opposed to the micro, macro. So yeah, it is a profound impact when we're looking at racialized trauma.
Yeah, I think, Veronica, you bring up a really great point. I'm going to get my science nerd hat on right now. And I think, you talk about this idea of how we are empathically connected to other people's pain and suffering. I think this empathic response system, sometimes called the brain's mirror neuron system. And this idea is that, I actually talked about it after the George Floyd, tragedy that took place. We all saw this happening on live TV in real time, but, just saw that the life being taken away from George Floyd. What it did is, people don't know, but, we have this, we're wired for community and connection and belonging. I talk about the brain as a social organ that we're, and that I have this great phrase that you actually wrote. I think you actually talk about it, and you say that, and we'll get to this. It's a good segue. Healing is more effective when you have a strong support system.
Right.
But the idea is that we are intrinsically, our brains are wired to empathically respond to the pain and suffering of others. And so when you see someone suffering, like the case of George Floyd, your brain registers that suffering as if you were experiencing yourself. Mm-hmm. So you can see how witnessing the George Floyd, death and the tragedy, and just seeing the brutality of humanity taking place was so horrific.
Right.
Really, it catalyzed, I think, a response on an individual level, especially if you're someone who can identify as George Floyd based on ethnicity or race, or even gender, et cetera. Right. And then you take this idea of all of us are seeing it at the same time. So all of us, I'm not saying that all of us we're traumatized to the same extent.
Right.
What I am saying is that all of us were impacted in the same way, that this is not right.
Exactly. So
that, I think, so in this way, and I don't want to say that I'm not trying to imply that George Floyd's death, served a higher purpose, but I'm saying that in some ways it catalyzed us to recognize that this is real. This is not something which is just we're hearing and hearsay. It's something we're witnessing and seeing taking place
in real time.
In real time. So you talk about the idea of healing. And so this is a great segue to this quote I just mentioned. I just pulled it off, I think, of your profile, because I love it so great. Healing is more effective when you have a strong support system. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on that?
I am, I'm all about group, collective, community, right? And my word is always community, collectivism. What can we do as a group, to support each other? Because what I've learned through coaching and doing therapy and things of that nature, and even based on what you just said about how we respond to seeing the pain of another person, right? We also respond the same way to seeing another person heal. And so when I did the research study with Cal State Long Beach and Marcia Dimes on the Long Beach Black Infant Health Program, it was centered around collectivism. So the moms were there as a group. They supported each other as a group. They called each other sister, right? They were able to share stories, share healing, right? And the program, we did different cohorts to collect the data over almost a 2-year period, right? And each cohort was 7 weeks. So we have 1 week introduction, 6 weeks of actual instruction of the content so we could gather the data, right? And each time is just the beauty of seeing the women connect and gather together to support each other, and how the women felt better, they felt supported, they felt community, which actually empowered them to keep going. Because down there, like, oh, I got my sisters, what would they say? I can't wait to come. Or even when I was, I facilitate groups, and some of the groups, the hardest group I ever do is grief and loss. It's always the hardest group for me. It's always just, but to see people together and the people realize I'm not the only person crying when I hear the coffee pot go on, because my husband used to make the coffee. And so it's just like, is this something just so powerful when we gather together as a group? And that's why I always say support, right? A support system really makes it easier for one to heal. And that goes back to, and I think you mentioned this earlier, the sharing of stories, because when we share stories, what it does is allow another person to say, oh, I'm not alone. We're reflections of each other. You understand in your way, but you understand, you see me. And it's very important. This is why I'm always about community. I have this analogy about if there's a table with 12 chairs, right? When I see a table with 12 chairs, the first thing that comes to my mind is, oh, there's a seat for such and such, such and such. Then I can bring such and such. I'm like, who can I invite to this table so we all can enjoy this glorious feast, right? And because that's how we build and rebuild, and this is how we heal. It's all through connection, support, and community.
Yeah, and I think, this is another segue to another topic. I use this phrase in my book, Science of a Happy Brain: to socialize is to survive, to thrive is to thrive. And
beautiful.
Yeah, and it's this idea where we're social beings and our brains evolve for social connection. And in the absence of that, our brains actually experience the pain of isolation, loss, in the same way that our registers physical pain. There are overlapping regions of the brain that do this. So how has COVID impacted this? Because, a lot of us, myself included, have been forced to either quarantine or live, whether we're contained or maybe our own social family unit, which itself has been challenging for some people, obviously. But do you think that, because you talk about the importance of connection and community, do you think that COVID has impacted or in some way limited that ability for us to authentically socially connect?
Yeah, COVID impacted the ability for physical connection, but increased the ability for connection, if that makes sense.
Very much.
A few organizations last year reached out to me to host support groups for people when COVID first hit. One of the organizations was the Utunde Price Resource Center located in Compton, which is founded by Venus and Serena Williams, named after their sister who was slain due to gun violence. And so I started this group. We meet weekly, and I'm actually still doing the group because I feel bad, like if I wasn't in the group, because everyone has just connected. It's like been people's safe space. But when the pandemic first hit, I was doing groups for them and groups for an organization called 211 LA. And a lot, what I noticed was the amplification, right, of certain things like anxious symptoms, depressive symptoms, things of that nature that was brought on by fear and isolation, right? And so what we saw was a lot of people were by themselves. And if those people are extroverts, or just required someone to hug them, or just engaging with people, they started to decline. But what people did discover after the initial, after the pandemic hit and we started to readjust, is Zoom became such a wonderful way for people to connect. Now we're seeing families from across the country who are having Friday family meetings now that they couldn't do before, because physically everybody couldn't get one space, but online they're having DJ parties, they're cooking together. And it just seemed like, I know a lot of people have Zoom fatigue from work, but what I have not noticed is that what I haven't seen is people saying they have Zoom fatigue from fun stuff. So there's there's so many different ways that people have connected. But in the beginning, the amplification of certain anxious symptoms, depressive symptoms was at an all-time high because people were by themselves. And it's almost similar to how they're cutting down on isolation, solitary confinement in the prisons, especially juvenile detention centers, because of the impact of isolation on the individual psyche. And so COVID just helped people reimagine what it is to connect and be part of community. Mm-hmm. But for some people, they did suffer in the beginning. Some are still suffering now, but they know now they can reach out.
Yeah, and I think that's especially as we're starting to make that re-entry process back into the world, especially here at Chapman, at least, I call it the rehumanization process. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us are struggling. I was talking about this idea that it's a lot of people think that the return back into normalcy, if that word is even accurate, whatever normal looks like. This idea is it's not a light, like an on and off switch. It's like a dimmer switch. I think a lot of people, like myself included, have to take these. We're not going to do a cannonball into the pool. We're going to do one toe at a time, or maybe one body part at a time until we get immersed in.
Right.
But we need to start recognizing how that rehumanization process is so key and it's crucial for our well-being. You know, it's almost like, I always like making these little jokes that help people memorize these. Like, we got to make sure we get our vitamin S. Vitamin S means vitamin social. So make your daily dose of vitamin, whether it's like, you know, talking to one person in real time or just doing a lunch date with someone you trust, and then make those slow steps because, because eventually we're going to be back on campus, at least in a few months in real time. I want to talk to you about your podcast, Intentional Healing.
Yes.
How can people, well, first we'll talk about how can people listen to your podcast before we go into more conversation about podcasts. So how can people listen to you and find you on the Intentional Healing podcast?
Well, the easiest way is to go to my Instagram page, because I have a link tree and it has the actual link. It's the Intentional Healing Podcast. Or you could type in Veronica Clanton-Higgins on Apple, Breaker, Google, Spotify, and it's on 7 platforms now. And so if you visit my social media pages, I have a social media page on Facebook, Intentional Healing Podcast, or Intentional Healing Podcast on Instagram, or you could just type it into wherever you listen to podcasts. But we're on Spotify and we're on Apple, Breaker, Google Podcasts. We're on 7 different platforms.
Right. So no excuse not to be able to find it.
And we're on YouTube. So if you type in, yes, we're on YouTube because we record it live.
And we'll make a plug for that for your podcast in this when we share this episode as well. Tell us about intention. What is that? How did you come with that term, intentional healing?
I am very intentional about everything, and I also people I'm intentional about everything because I'm a Black woman, and let me tell you, I have learned to monitor myself, code switch, do it all, right? So I've always been very intentional with even how I use my hands and my words and my movement to make people feel comfortable, because especially as a clinician and a coach, I always want people to feel comfortable. And so one time we were having a discussion somewhere in one of the community spaces, and someone said, "You need a podcast." I said, "Oh my God, another task. You're trying to give me another task. I don't want another task." It's like, "No, but you're really good with people, and I love listening to you." And so I was like, okay. And it's this running joke. They call me the Compton emotional healer. And they also call me hood and holistic because I'm a little bit of, I'm a perfect balance of both. And so when I thought about the Intentional Healing Podcast, I was like, well, what do I want to do? So I'm all about community, but I'm also about sharing the stories. I love hearing people tell stories about their lives. And so I said, how can I use, what will it be like? I don't want it to be like any other podcast. And so what I did was created a podcast where I curate questions so people can get to share their story and talk about themselves and their experiences. And other people can listen and heal from it. So I'm intentional with the questions and even the flow of questions that I ask, because of course, like you already know with your podcast, questions change, but how do you keep the flow so it's still intentional and it still goes along the line of the narrative? And so I'm all about the sharing of stories. I'm also the founder of TEDx Compton Boulevard, which is another platform that I've given people in the community of Compton to share stories.
And I think, first of all, I really enjoyed listening. I listened to a couple episodes over the weekend, and I really encourage our listeners to check out your podcast, Intentional Healing. I listened to the first one. I think it was called Urban Sophisticate.
Yes.
I really love that name. I think it's great. And you bring up a really good point. I'm going to put my nerdy science hat back on again.
Go ahead. I love that hat.
I did a part of my research is in cognitive, neuroscience and cognitive linguistics. So what that really means is how we use language as a way to kind of, navigate our world. And so you bring up this really important tool called code switching. I know what that term means. And so someone like myself who is an immigrant and who grew up in the Indian American, community, I code switch, sometimes, but I think this is very important too, because sometimes people don't recognize that we carry different, we embody different identities.
Right.
And those identities get expressed differently through our language.
Right.
So and I find this to be the case, like I can only talk in a certain way to certain people in my community that they would understand. And it's a way, again, that social brain, we code switch.
Right.
Or to feel a sense of belonging and identity to a community.
Right.
But I also can see how that can be very burdensome.
Exhausting.
Yeah, tell me about that. Why do you feel like, in your experience, why do you find that to be an exhausting, people who may not know how, what code switching is,
yes,
know what that is. Tell us what that term really means and how that can be really exhausting on someone who is just trying to be authentic.
Absolutely. So code switching is when you actually switch up your language, your linguistics, your dialect, to adjust to a setting. In particular, and I'm so glad, Dr. J, that you mentioned your background, because I know you experienced it as well, that if you were at school or in a business meeting, you would speak differently than what you would with your family and your friends, right? And so particularly with, as African-American women, we would, a lot of times we call it code switching, where we actually are trying to assimilate to the dominant culture to be accepted, right? So that also comes with other, when we will also assimilate our hair or our dress and things of that nature, in order to be accepted, in order to be taken seriously, and things of that nature. And so in the beginning, I would do that, and it was very exhausting. And I will monitor my my language, because I have a colorful language, and so I would monitor the words that I use, the dialect, tone, and all of that, right? And it wasn't until recently, like about 3 or 4 years ago, that I stopped code switching. Because guess what? I was tired. So you're going to get this head wrap. You're going to get all the smiles and giggles that come with me being my authentic self, because if we want to embrace diversity and anti-racism, we have to embrace ourselves. And so what I started to do is to show up as my authentic self, because before I would come in, just make sure, okay, is this the hairstyle that I should wear? Let me make sure I keep my voice down. Let me make sure I use the larger words and things of that nature, as opposed to like just being myself. And I'm a highly intelligent woman. And, I can navigate all spaces, and I want people to remember me for my energy and not, we call it we have this joke that when people are still finding themselves, or when you go on a date or you first meet people, you meet their representative, you don't meet their true self. So they usually send in their representative, which is the best behaved version of themselves. And so, and then, you know, human nature, after 3 to 6 weeks, that you can only put up a facade for so long. But yeah, my representative does not show up. I show up in my authenticity and my authentic self. And so I might say, hey, boo, or hey, how you doing? How's your day going? All right, that's good. You know, that's what you're gonna get.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that you stopped code switching, you know, because it is really important for people to recognize that people who are not part of the predominant or top hierarchy, you know, culture, if you will, we're sometimes forced to assimilate. I know this being the model minority, you know, I think this is certainly the case for myself. I speak from this from experience when we came to the United States from India via the UK to Chicago.
Oh, wow.
Suburbs of Chicago.
Right.
It was really hard, you know, to assimilate, and you really had to you had to adopt the culture, language, you know, persona, food, everything to be accepted. So it goes to this idea of healing. I think it talks about healing, and this is something I think is a good segue to the last thing, how we begin to heal from trauma, you know, from racially motivated trauma. And this idea of healing for me, another course I teach is health, healing, and wholeness. Healing, the word healing itself is related to the English word whole, W-H-O-L-E. And so I love this metaphor that healing is the journey towards wholeness.
That's beautiful.
And so we're all in some way trying to become whole, whether it's an individual or a society.
Right.
What are some ways, you know, what are some resources that you can provide to, say, our Chapman community, let's say, people who might be, who have experienced racialized trauma or have experienced some form of discrimination or injustice? What are some thoughts or advice you can perhaps give to us today?
Well, I recently got trained in something that's called therapy that liberates. And what it looks at is, how do we work in a trauma-informed framework for BIPOC populations, right? And so number one is just, it's okay to go to therapy or support group that is trauma-informed, right? And it's also perfect to find support for people who've experienced the same thing that you've experienced. So that goes back to the community, to collectivism. And then it's also about identifying how it's impacted you on, and like on a micro level. Do you feel it in your body? So when we look at somatic therapy, right, and we're looking at, somatic is like the body and how the body experiences things. So when we're looking at, have you pay attention to your body? I always tell people, let's pay attention to our body, right? What are you feeling? Where do you feel it? How intense is it, right? And this is why meditation, I know people are like, no. Meditation, journaling, quiet time, they help rewire the brain's response to triggers, right? The brain thrives on repetition. And so when you do things over, you are literally rewiring the brain. Them synapses are going to fire off differently, right? And you'll start to feel different. And this is why we always encourage meditation. There's some practitioners who do race-based yoga, right? Healing circles. So there are healing circles that you could tap into. Make an appointment at SPCS. Going to the Cross Cultural Center. They also have resources, limiting media, like social media, staying on social media, getting involved. But if you get involved, if you want to become an advocate or an activist, because there's two different ways to this. An advocate means that you're using your voice to help others, right? So those who have been silenced, you're like, I will be your voice. Let me advocate for you, right? And activism is we're going to institute change. Like, how can we change policy? How are we going to get out? We're going to protest. We're going to do this, right? When you're doing those things, make sure that you check in with yourself first for the why, right? Because we don't want your trauma and fear leading your advocacy and your activism, because that could actually make your trauma worse. Okay, so you want to check in with yourself. You want to spend quiet time, limit social media, color therapy, change the colors in your space, music therapy. Frequencies do such amazing things to the brain, right? I always tell the students that I work with, if they're feeling sad, don't play no sad playlist. Where's your happy playlist? Okay, we want the happy playlist this week. Okay, don't listen to I'm gonna cry, I'm in love playlist. We also want to look at movement, especially for BIPOC people. We love, and not saying that non-BIPOC people don't like to move, but moving your body. This is why yoga and dance are so important. It helps to release, right? And so you want to do things that get you out. So I like that vitamin S, get that social, right? Get some vitamin D, because we need vitamin D. It helps to improve the mood, right? Get some vitamin T, get some therapy and some counseling as well. There's just so many different things that you can do to actually tap into, and I always say being intentional about your healing process, right? And remember, things don't happen overnight. Your brain needs time to rewire itself. So this is why you have to do it over and over. Even 5 minutes a day works, and over again. And so, yeah, just tap into your self-care, finding community, finding your voice, therapy, vitamin S, vitamin D. All of those things are wonderful ways to begin the healing process, because healing is not linear. It is a journey. So just remember that as well.
And that is so a wonderful reminder, to our listeners, healing is a journey. It's not linear. And, be kind to your mind, learn to be kind to yourself. And then once you learn to be kind to yourself, you be kinder to others. And the last thing I'll say before we kind of just close is that there's no, I think it's important that we do seek therapy when we are struggling with our mental health. This is a key component to this 4-part series, our Mental Health Awareness Month. I've suffered and experienced, trauma, grief, loss, depression, anxiety, you name it, the whole gamut. It's been there. And, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't seek out support.
Absolutely.
So, especially for people in the BIPOC community where there could be some resistance to it. I think it's very important to be aware that specifically that people who are in certain communities, may have hesitation. So know that our brains are wired the exact same way.
Absolutely, the brain is the brain.
Because brains are wired the same way. So therapy works for all.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's good to have this. I'm glad that you're doing this series, because we really need to collectively work to remove the stigma of assessing mental health care for BIPOC communities, because a lot of times people are like, I don't want to talk to nobody. I'm gonna go to church, or I'm just gonna go exercise, or I'm gonna go have a drink, or I'm gonna smoke a joint, right? Because it has been such stigmatized. But what we're doing now with your podcast and with May being Mental Health Awareness Month, and even since the onset of what happened last year with COVID and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, we're seeing an increase in BIPOC individuals actually going forth and getting therapy or coaching and counseling. And remember, therapy is for mental health concerns. Coaching is for goal setting and to help you reach a goal, okay? And it's always clear that if you suffered a trauma, you want a therapist. Yes. So we went to school a very long time.
Yes, you did.
To help you work through that. So yes, just understand you can pray, go to church, go to mosque, and still come to therapy.
Right. The healing is there are multiple paths we can take.
Absolutely.
And therapy is a core component of that. So I would like to thank you so much, Veronica. What's your email for your Chapman email? Can you share?
It is Clanton-Higgins at chapman.edu.
Great. So if anyone in our Chapman community wants to reach out to you, they can. And please know that the Student Psychological Counseling Services, as well as the Fish Interface Center, Cross-Cultural Center, there are many resources to support you here in our community. And you can listen to this podcast on our Fish Interfaith Facebook page, as well as SoundCloud and Twitter and Instagram. And please be sure to catch Veronica's podcast, Intentional Healing. And we look forward to having you join us next episode, our final in the 4-part series, where I'll be interviewing Dr. Gail Stearns, who is the Dean of here at the Wallace Fish Interface Center. And we're talking about how to become ready, resilient, and reflective in a world of change and uncertainty.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, again, Veronica, thank you so much for being here, and we are grateful for all that you do. That you're doing for here at Chapman, but also for the larger world.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.